Welcome to the Peace Country Historical Society podcast, where we blend community voices with historical expertise and talk about history in the Peace Country. From early settlers to modern trailblazers, we explore how history shapes our lives today. Subscribe to the Peace Country Historical Society podcast, where the past speaks and we listen.
Welcome to the Peace Country History Society podcast. This is a series of 6 podcasts we're making as part of our job to communicate history of the region to you. It's good to have you with us this morning or this afternoon, whenever you tune in. What we're talking about today as part of our project is the question of what's been in the news so much in 2023, and that's forests and forest fires. We have the question of fire being a constant presence in our region. Everyone knows the stories of smoke from fires, but this year the fires came close to home, closer perhaps than they have for many years. And so we have some guests today with some experience both of the woods and of fires, and to talk a bit about the stories, because our purpose in the History Society is to be storytellers of stories that could be lost to posterity and really are worthy of remembering. So this much I want to remind people of. We're telling the stories of the peace today, and our guests today are Pat Wearmouth on my left and Doug Spry on my right. We're going to talk a bit about why they're involved in this topic and what their experience is. So I'm going to hand over to you first, Pat.
Thanks, Duff. My name is Pat, as Duff has said, and I'm a retired forester. I have some education in forestry, many years in the forestry community and business, and I've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of people about how forestry works and done some of it myself. I'm also a member of the Peace Country Historical Society and very interested in the local history of the Peace Country. And because of that, I've spoken to many old-timers, people that know things, and some of them knew a lot about fire. So that's me. I want to, though, make a disclaimer on Doug and my's behalf. Neither of us are fire experts or professional historians. Our remarks today come from a personal perspective, which basically develops over the years as you work in the forest community and understand some things and talk to a lot of people who actually know stuff, as I've said. And with that, I'll turn it to Doug.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Yes, my interest here is, I've always had an interest in history, and over the years, and packing horses into the mountains and through the bushes, and so I'm quite familiar with what could and does happen sometimes when a fire does go through some of these areas, and also the difficulties of firefighting as well. But I was born and raised about 10 miles straight south of where this fire went through, and I was a year and a half old at the time, so my memories are what I heard from my parents and neighbors afterwards, and they talked about it for many years.
But you actually fought a fire yourself in later years.
I did. When I worked in the bush as a logger, I got tangled up in one afternoon. And
You smelled the smoke yourself.
I did so, and I got some retardant on me because I was in the skidder and didn't get out of the way in time.
That's right. Water bombers give gifts both ways. Well, let's kick off with what, Pat, is a forest fire.
Well, I think I'll start by explaining quickly the components of a fire. If you picture a triangle, 3 sides, the one side represents the fuel, the thing that's going to burn. Another side represents air, or particularly oxygen, which you need for a fire to burn, the fuel to burn. And the last side, the third side, is either heat, or another word for that would be ignition, some way to start the chemical reaction, which is what fire is. It's called the fire triangle, and it's the basis for a lot of firefighting or it is the basis for firefighting. People that do this for a living need to understand that triangle. The triangle is important because it explains how to get a fire going as well as to stop it. And by that I mean each of the three sides of the triangle are important, and if you lose one of them, the fire either won't start or it goes out. And I'll give you an example. If we're on the fuel side, we would merely add fuel to start a fire, but take it away to stop it. And an example of that would be using crawler tractors to make a fire break and push the fuel away from the active flame. For the air or oxygen side, we would smother it with, let's say, foam dropped from an aircraft. And if it was heat we were trying to get rid of, we would cool it down, again, probably by using an aircraft to spread water on the fire. So that's, I think, an understanding that firefighters need because they're working with one of those three sides all the time. So that's fire. And I want to start off by saying it's a very natural thing in the forests. It is, particularly in Alberta, which is mostly boreal forest, it is the major renewal tool that forests use to recreate themselves every so often. It's good to remember that fire, this comes from an Aesop fable, is a good servant, but it's a bad master. So I'm going to kind of lead you through bad and good of forest fires. So for the good, fires will remove the debris, and by that I mean fallen down trees, leaf litter, the needles, all the dry stuff that's on the ground, plus a bit of the logs and things that are around, and create a new seed bed for seeds to fall on. And the important thing is that some mineral soil be exposed. Tree seeds are basically pretty small, and they want to sprout where they can have access to water, which is mineral soil, but also nutrients, which come from, in the beginning, the ashes from the burn. And you may remember you doing it, or at least your parents doing it, always putting the ashes from the stove out on the garden. There was nutrients to be had for the plants. The next thing it does is remove shade so that the sunlight, the solar energy, will hit the ground and warm it up. It doesn't take a whole lot of warmth, but you need to warm up soil that's been cold and shaded for many, many years. So the fire will do that for you. It'll also take away the shade of standing trees. And that's a good thing because the trees that come back first, which are called pioneer trees, in this country are the pine and the aspen. And both of them require full sunlight on their canopy to grow and prosper properly. So it means that the pioneer species, which are the ones that are set up to come in first, have a better chance. The other thing it does is bring on a flush of plants which serve as wildlife habitat. They provide food, some shelter, because not everything burns in a fire. There's always scattered patches of timber that remains. And but it will provide this habitat. So there's some of the good. The bad, well, it threatens life. It destroys the current habitat for plants and animals. It destroys the infrastructure that humans depend on, and that would be houses, outbuildings, power lines, communication towers. For instance, both of our northern territories, the Yukon and the Northwest Territories, are dependent on structures that are in the forests in Alberta. Also, it's dangerous to evacuate. There's a lot of bad things that also can come from fire uncontrolled. Interrupts the lives with emergency evacuations, and it produces smoke, which harms health. And at least this year, from some of the farmers I've spoke to, there's a belief that it probably slowed the growth of crops. Now I'd like to move on to the summer of 23, the one we've just been by, because eventually I want to make some comparisons, or we will make some comparisons of historical fires and this summer. How bad was it? Well, quite frankly, it was terrible for forest fires. With the constant news about new fires and evacuations and smoke in the air almost every day, I think people are kind of knew this was going to be a bad year, and it was. The numbers bear this out. As of October, about 2.2 million hectares, which is 5.3 million acres, burned in Alberta. And that is roughly 32 times the size of the area that Edmonton occupies, scattered all over Alberta. It's a big piece of land, and it's a record. There's never been anything like this in recorded history. Now, that just includes the area that was burnt in the forest zone, the green zone, some of you may know, but it didn't include agriculture land and municipal lands, which are the white zone, if you happen to be familiar with the maps. So there's more that was lost there in private and municipal, as I said. So it was somewhat greater than what I've just spoken of. And Alberta is not unique in this. Other provinces, as well as the whole country of Canada, also set records for the forest fires this summer. Unfortunately, 60% of the fires were caused by humans being out in the forest and doing something not so good, I guess. So 60%, 34% were the result of natural, which is in Alberta, is lightning, as you probably all know. Those big cumulus clouds and thunderstorms come with them. Well, thunder is caused by lightning, so if it's over a forest, there's a good chance something might get going. 6%, I'll just tell you what the other 6% was, is under investigation, because the one thing the wildfire fighting people like to know is how did this start and where did it start, and they'd like to know it for every fire.
Maybe it's a good time to get into one of those first historical fires that you did so much research on.
Yeah, and I think the first one is what I'll refer to as Mrs. Campbell's fire. It's called that for a reason. In 1961, a local lumberman named Albert Hansen, interviewed a woman named Mrs. Campbell, who at the time thought she was about 103 years old. So she was born around 1858. And when she was 30 years old, she was living at Lake Saskatoon with her husband and her family. They had several children, and they made their living as trappers. And she told Albert that about 1889, the rains quit, and they didn't come back for 3 years. And almost as soon as the rain quit, the forest caught on fire and started to burn. And it did so for 3 years, 1889, 90, and 91. Years of the big smoke, I think was one of the words she told Albert. She was an Indigenous woman. They were living at Lake Saskatoon, as I've mentioned. And during the worst of this fire, which covered a lot of the area around Lake Saskatoon, Wembley, and south of Grande Prairie, and I'll get into how far it actually went in a bit, but on the worst of days, her and her hubby would bury their possessions in the shore of Lake Saskatoon, and then get the kids, and they'd all go stand in the water during the high burning period, which is normally about 11 o'clock in the morning till 4 in the afternoon. They just stand there. I'm sure it wasn't much fun. You'd have to hold some of the young kids up in your arms. And then they'd come out in the evenings when the fire's down and, try and carry on their life. At some point, it would have become just too onerous. So they decided they had to pack up and leave. And Albert explains that they wound up in the foothills in BC somewhere, either between Lake Saskatoon and Chetwynd, or maybe even as far south as Tumbler Ridge. But what there was not a lot of fire, which meant there was animals to hunt for food, and there was plants and berries and things they could use for medicine and other kinds of food. because, quite frankly, when they left, there wasn't much left here. It was burnt to smithereens. They came back. I'm not sure how long they stayed over there, but when they came back to Lake Saskatoon. But there still wasn't really a good way to make a living, so they moved down to Pipestone Creek, the mouth of Pipestone Creek on the Wapiti. And they stayed there until things greened up, and they were eventually able to come back to the north and begin trapping again, although a different place. The only other thing I want to say is this area here was actually the northern end of an area of fires that burnt from Jasper all the way to Lake Saskatoon. And it's not a continuous burn. I've said before that not all of the forest burns in any given fire. It'll skip patches. And in our case, we know because the spruce is older than the pine that it must have skipped a lot of white spruce stands. But the reason we know the fire's year that she told Albert are probably correct is because we measured ages in my job. One of the jobs I did was to inspect and examine timber and make comments about it. One of the things you do when you do that is you discover the age of sample trees. And it literally, every pine in my career that I ever sampled south and west of Grande Prairie was the same age. And I would phone a friend in Hinton, which was near Jasper, and they would tell me the same thing. In about 1889 to 90, the pine trees were all approaching 100 years. Take you back to that pioneer species. Pine trees start right after a fire. First of all, the fire melts the glue that holds the cone together, so the cone pops open and the pine seed falls on this seed bed I talked about. And so they start relatively quickly and establish themselves. So that just simply leads to a point that I'm making here. Fire was a terrible master in that it did so much destruction and damage and destroyed the forest, and people had to leave like the Campbells. But the good thing is it created the forest that we see now.
So Pat, just to interrupt,
Yeah.
this aging of the trees is all done by counting tree rings, right?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
That's amazing. And so you can actually say this is a uniform region, and possibly in another 100 years, people will look at some of the forest area here, do
Yeah.
the tree ring count and say, oh, this will be a 2020 fire time.
Yes.
When that forest that grows back now will be of one uniform
Yeah.
age.
That's right.
It's remarkable. You're dating, and this is for historians very helpful sometimes, to date the people's time by when they come back after fires burned off and cleared the land. I mean, this is a major, the tree ring count is a major benchmark
Yes.
for historians as
It
well
is.
as foresters.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now,
No.
you said there's more, is there more on the Campbell fire, or is it time to talk about the very destructive Moose Hill fire?
I think that would, your latter would be the best thing to do.
All right, let's
Duff.
go there. Let's go to
let's
the
go
Moose
to the
Hill
Moose
fire.
Hill fire.
Okay, the Moose Hill Fire, referred to as that, is the north of where I live, the Saddle Hills area. That was on May the 4th, 1944. Ferocious. Came from the east by Webster, and went right on through to the Big Smoky River. And it actually jumped over the Smoky there as well. So. And in its path, there were sawmills, homes, livestock, wildlife, and the lives of 2 young firefighters, plus a third one that did make it out, suffered from severe burns, and took a while for him to recover from his adventure there within the heat and the smoke. And in the hospital for about 3 months he was. That past winter, it had been extremely dry, hardly anything for snow, so the forest was very dry and no rain to speak of. There'd been some fires burning north of Webster along the railway tracks, is presumably where this fire had started from. And the wind, when it come up there about 10 o'clock, 10:30 or so in the morning, was the most that Grande Prairie Airport had ever recorded. Really strong wind, severe. And with the smoke and whatnot being visible, the forest ranger in Sexsmith had sent out a party to take care of some of this firefighting, whatever they could do, not knowing exactly what was going back up in the hills there. There was young Wilford DeRoche, Raphael Klein, Stanley Kraskowski, and 3 others to represent this firefighting crew were sent to Webster. Jess Sanborn went in and picked them up at Webster, drove them out to the sawmill site, arriving there about 11 o'clock. At this time, the smoke was getting pretty bad. Sam Badger, he was a worker at the sawmill, was sent out on horseback to see how close the fire was. And at this point, when he got back, he was saying, "Get out." And then as it turned out, too, there was no possible way these people were able to get out of there because the fire was so bad and the smoke visibility was just in darkness pretty well. The sawmill crew, the firefighters used buckets there from a dugout, trying to save the cook shack. Jesse himself ran into the barn and kicked off some boards in the back wall and let some horses out. And the heat being so intense at that time, Jesse tells everybody to get to the dam. Well, visibility is something else again. So in the commotion, they did make it to the dam and go down onto the edge there into the mud and down where you could breathe and hopefully get a little bit of protection there from the water, but had no time to make any head counts, in the smoke like that, people running and chasing and trying to find their way. And then when they did get down to the dam, all of a sudden, everything broke loose, explosions, gas barrels, truck tires. So when the smoke began to lift a bit, then they turned around and got out of there, regrouping a little bit, taking a head count. Then at that point, they realized that the 3 young fellows weren't in their head count there. But there was nothing they could do at that time. So the crew, Jess and his wife and the crew, they all got out and they got out to the Bad Heart River and then a trail to the Webster area there. And
So how experienced were these 3 young guys?
what I gather in the stuff I've read, no, they did not have any
Too
experience.
young and inexperienced.
They were young fellows, and and even at that time, who really did have a fire training. So
Now, this is 1944, right?
Yes.
So would any experienced firefighters have been over at the war then and had left with a manpower shortage at home?
well, that's the thing, yeah, because there was no, the war was on, and a lot of people were there that maybe would have had some experience. Especially with their background in homesteading, they would have had fires that got out of control, and so they had to fight them on their own place. And they presumed that, well, I shouldn't say presuming, it was during the fire there that Dr. Gamey and them people in Sexsmith were involved. Jack Nays was the one that took the young fellow into the hospital after he got out. Then there was Effie Berg, who tells the story of her mother, Fern Parker, leaving the neighbors with a team of 4 children. Shortly after arriving at the neighbor's place, they could see smoke and wind coming up, so they headed back home. When they got into the yard at her home there, Arnold Sparks rode in telling them to get out. So Mom loaded some food and blankets left. Smoke being so bad at this time, they only made it about a half a mile and the horses dropped dead. So she remembered an open spot in a previous burn, so they crawled to the spot about a half a mile away. Mom removed her dress to cover the youngsters because of the heat. When the fire had passed over, they walked to a neighbor's home, arriving about 10 o'clock that night. And Mother was blind for 3 months from the smoke. It took them 3 months to recover. Then there was Chris Henniger, who had started his own sawmill business there in about 1940. He lost everything, including a brand new 3-ton truck for hauling lumber and a team of horses. Bruno Braunberger, he lost his barn, 2 horses, granary full of wheat, and some lumber. And later on that year, he moved west of Webster. And, I remember his place out there. Bob Campbell, he suffered the loss of his home belongings and all the livestock. George Love was another one, barely escaped with his truck as he was helping Chris Henniger, who had a sawmill in the path of the fire. Removing some of the belongings, so much smoke, it did affect George's lungs for quite some time there.
Wow, you're talking about family names and stories of their survival. You're talking about some pretty interesting stories that are still in family tradition. And our audience could be noting these people by the names that Doug is bringing up, saying, wow, each of these is a family story, all of them with some kind of resilience. I mean, to go back to your triangle, the idea that go to a burned over area is as safe as going to water. If you can't find water, find a burned over area.
Right.
Because there's no fuel to protect you. But you're also talking about the smoke doing a lot of damage, lasting damage, just because you have to breathe it and see through it. So it's that's the other side of it. And we certainly saw the damage smoke could do this year as well. Yeah. Wow, what else have you got?
And there is a plaque recognizing the fact that these 2 young fellows that burnt in the fire, Raphael Klein and Wolford DeRoche, that plaque is up in the hills there, and it's in place, and so at least you got a little bit of a memory there that this is where it happened, and this is what can happen.
So hikers that go up and see the plaque can pause for a minute and think about the people there that, very young and inexperienced, and fire took them.
That's right.
It's again another reminder, just like this year, that fire is not nice.
And it was a confusion too in all that smoke there that they did get separated from the rest of the group and made a run for it. And the wrong thing to do, but
The dam, Doug, just for people that might not pick that up, it was a creek that was dammed, water for the
Yes.
steamer, I'm guessing?
yes, it was for the steam engine. It was an ephemeral creek,
Yeah.
and they dammed it up. Previous fellow had dammed it before Jess Sanborn got in there, and that was used for the steam engine and the horses in the bush. And,
Well, there's a common theme there is water, because the Campbell family did it as well. So-
that's right.
No
Yes.
kidding.
Yeah.
And it couldn't have had much water because of those dry summers ahead of time, too.
It sounded pretty shallow
Yeah.
there, so yes.
Yeah.
Well, you got to think on your feet, and you better be organized. I mean, what I'm hearing compared to, say, this year is the teams this year, there's a lot of emphasis on prior training and organization, which these guys, they were winging it.
That's right.
That's when it gets dangerous.
Oh, I should say so.
Yeah,
Yes, that's right.
You're right. Yeah. Oh, wow. Man, Doug, that's what a story.
A lot of hardships there.
Yeah, no kidding.
And relocation. Some of them had to relocate to different places and, and build and get ready for winter.
Yeah,
And the timber that's gone.
it's all gone.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is what you grew up hearing stories of, you've now documented and demonstrated actually happened.
Yes. Yes, and it meant a lot to me because the one girl and Jess's daughter was the same age as me, and visited with my mom and dad. And so some memories there from way back.
Yes, and you kept that tradition alive by sharing it today. Thank you, Doug.
Great, welcome.
That's good stuff. So I think it's time now to look at how we compare all these fires and contrast the things. And for that, we pulled out some pretty important points that people could note to watch for in the future, to think about. But it's time to probably shift back to you, Pat, and give us some comparisons to these fires and how to think about them.
Sure. Well, I'll go through a list of points, but I just wanted to make the point that there was a lot of news about fires this summer. And oftentimes, the word climate change would come up as being a cause, and sometimes almost to the point was, this is what caused it all. And although it played a part, climate change, for sure, there's no doubt about that, but there was a lot of other factors at play this summer. And I kind of like to go through them for a minute and and then we can do some comparisons. So the first one is that compared to historic fires, even as far back as 1890s and certainly 1944, there's a lot more accumulation of dead vegetation in the forest these days as a result of some really successful firefighting that went on through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And people were cognizant of the fact that they sort of knew that this might happen, but the whole idea was to put out fires. That's what society wanted. So we have to say that the fuel loading, that one side of the triangle, was probably greater this summer than it had been in the past. The next point would be that this year there were, and this is a big one, there was a way more communities and human infrastructure in the forest than there would have been back then. And by that I mean things like houses, outbuildings, industrial buildings, maybe even some commercial buildings, but some that you wouldn't think of. Power lines, particularly ones that go to remote communities that only have one power line coming to them. And they're present in Alberta. Communication towers. Both the Northwest Territories and the Yukon depend on infrastructure that starts close, just across the border in BC or in Alberta, and a fire can take out, probably not a steel communication tower, but it can take out the power supply. So it doesn't work, and nobody up in the territories has got communications anymore.
And wooden railway trestles too.
Yes, and wooden railway trestles.
There's communication. Got a good reminder there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So historic fires, of course, had a little infrastructure. Doug's Moose Hill fire, it had to go from west of Webster through that whole Moose Hill country where the two young men were killed, and go quite a long ways to hit the settlements in the Bad Heart and north of Teepee Creek, where those other people got burnt out of either their sawmill or their homes. But in the scheme of things, compared to today, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure out there. So it was maybe just a little less serious because of that. People got burnt out every so often, but there wasn't the volume like there is now. I was talking to an emergency measures manager for the county of Grande Prairie recently, and he said one of the scariest experiences that he had was realizing that when one of the fires that was coming out of the Wapiti Valley, and it might have been the Dimsdale fire, I'm not 100% sure, but he said, here I am, I don't have the resources, and I'll get into that in a minute, but I don't have any helicopters or airplanes that I can water bomb this thing with. They're coming from Edmonton. Who's going to get to the top of the bank first? Will it be the fire or will it be the helicopters? And because as soon as the fire went over the bank, there was going to be 450 dwellings in front of it. Luckily for him and for all of us, the helicopters got there first and were able to bucket a lot of water down to make a fire line. So many fires, and he was just suffering like a lot of people on fires were. Alberta had so many fires start in so many scattered locations across the province, they simply ran out of resources, which is not the usual. Alberta, normally, the fires hit a region because of some local event, like the rain falling like crazy down south of us, but this is dry, so we get the water bombers stationed here. But we also have periods of time where BC doesn't have a lot of fires or Alberta doesn't have a lot of fires, and we'll bring in the fire crews to where they're needed. So resources always seem to be there. And this year, one of the reasons for it being so bad was they weren't available anymore because all of those people had their own issues to deal with, especially in BC, as you probably know. So international help was called. You'll remember that we had fire crews from South Africa, Australia, and the United States, just as examples. and resources were limiting. So that's some of the reasons why this year was probably a worse year. One other thing maybe to mention is all of those are kind of fire as a bad master. They affected people's lives big times, evacuations and smoke and you name it.
Now, there's a way to measure the intensity of fires, right?
Yeah.
Something with initial FYI or something like that?
Yeah, it's a good point, Duff, and let me just explain that for a minute, because it's the one difference that was surprisingly not as bad as historical fires. That's the way it appears. I'm going to put up a picture just to try and explain, so you can hold this picture in your head for a little bit of time. Those of you that are listening only to audio, I'll try and describe it a little bit. Forest firefighter and managers use a rating system to explain or think about and make predictions about how a fire will behave. They measure the dryness of fuel, they look at the weather, how fast is the wind going to blow, what are the fine fuels, the kindling, if you will, on the forest floor. And they combine all these into something called the Fire Weather Index.
FWI.
And it is, FWI. And it actually gives a firefighter a reasonable, it shows them the possibilities of what could happen. The Slave Lake fire, which some of you remember, I think it was perhaps 2016, something like that, certainly within all of our memory, I suspect, and this is relative ratings. They are just a scale of numbers where a bigger number means the situation is worse. So one of the ways you can look at it is FWI measures the ferocity of the fire. And Slave Lake had a numerical rating of 35, I think it was, something like that. Fort Mac, a year or two later, had a rating of, I think it was 65. And you see the numbers on the slide, for those of you that can see it. There's an example of what a fire at 14 and an example of a fire at 34. You can see how they get bigger and more ferocious. The Moose Hill fire that Doug has talked about, some people in the fire center in Alberta went back to old weather records from probably, again, the Grande Prairie Airport, and knowing what the factors were, calculated a fire weather index of 110. Wow. That was a ferocious fire. It is no wonder that Mr. Badger told people to get the heck out of the way, that there was nothing to be done but to hide in the water if they could. It was amazing.
Okay.
And Mrs. Campbell has a similar story. There's no numbers, but the fierceness of that fire that she talked to with Albert Hansen leads me to believe, and this is personal perspective again, that the one thing that the 23 fires is they didn't burn as hot, because when you look at the FWI for 2023 summer, they kind of come in at a lot of them being between 10 and 30. I think the highest one was, it was like 59 or something like that. So they're not at the 110 level. And they use the rating system. So there was many, many factors. And let me just go over them again. Fuel loading, communities in the way, communications towers and lines, power lines, all kinds of things that make the news and make it what it is, which was a terrible year, a record area burned. But some things just didn't seem to be as bad. And that's about it.
Okay, well, let's put it together in a package
Yeah.
here. So what I'm hearing you guys say is that the triangle has to be always there. And if it's not going to be a lot of fuel, there's still going to be enough to give you some kind of fire. And depending on the wind, the oxygen, and the availability of firefighting, the intensity may vary. You just implied that the Campbell fire 100 years ago or more was probably totally ferocious, probably looking at something as intense as the Moose Hill fire of 109 or 65 or,
Well, let me interrupt you for a minute.
yes, please do.
At the place where Mrs. Campbell could see,
Yeah,
but
okay.
we don't want to apply that to the entire
Okay.
area from Lake Saskatoon all the way down to Jasper.
That's helpful. Thank
Because
you.
we know there must have been slow fires as well.
Okay. So there we have a fire that totally, in this area, swept the landscape and gave us a kind of a dateline for
Yeah.
regrowth too.
That's right.
And that, again, the survival of get to the water, and then you have to leave because the place is temporarily a desert for living a traditional lifestyle. Big impact. Now, then we go to Moose Hill, and we see the intensity there being much worse when people were perhaps least equipped in training or equipment to deal with it. You know, they were caught at the worst possible moment with some of the worst possible conditions. And you know, the old story that, and we know this from looking at the records, that getting burnt out was a part of life when it was just the house or just the barn. Part of the pioneer experience was every now and then somewhere there'd be a grass fire or a forest fire, and people would get burned out, and then they'd come back and rebuild, usually. But now we're talking in 2023 about a totally different context because of the spread of settlement, the spread of people living into the forest, surrounded by the forest, so that even though it may not have been as intense as the Moose Hill fire, it was more disruptive to Alberta and everyone in it. And this time we had the infrastructure and we had the planning and the organization to do these massive evacuations, because we knew that if fires got into towns, like we saw this with Fort McMurray, you could lose everyone and not even get them out of town if it was too isolated. Hence the government's rush to evacuate and the desire to prolong the evacuation until there was absolutely no risk, leaving Alberta was basically on pins and needles for 3 months this summer.
That's right.
And yet the fire wasn't as bad, but more threatening to our life as we know it. So putting that all together, you know, it's a tribute to our ancestors that they got through this stuff. And it's also a challenge for us to plan ahead and to think ahead. The good news in a way was we were more prepared, better planned to do this, and yet it was more disruptive because it was bigger, less intense, but it was right in our face. You know, when you
Yeah.
talk about the fire coming up the valley out of towards Dimsdale, when it comes over the top, there's a subdivision right there. And at that point, we're calling on the military to come in. And as you know, we had a company of soldiers parked out near Dimsdale to help with the fighting, along with the bombers and the helicopters, because the country had to come to the rescue, not just here, but in Quebec and in British Columbia as well. The question now is, are we prepared enough for the future? Do we have to have more than one plan? But more than anything else, we have to see that it's not just a simple part of life, it's a part of everybody's life. And to think and be aware, and not just to throw it into the idea that, well, it's global warming and we can't do anything about it, but also to take those steps. You know, I'm going to look around my place, even though I live in a subdivision, I'm going to look around my place for places where a fire could run up against the house. I'm also going to look at making sure that any fire I have is properly protected. So I'm not going to be providing fuel, I'm going to watch my ignition. And I think that's the challenge that a lot of us can look out, take a second look around our land, even around our homes, and ask ourselves, you know, are we ready for what may come? So I want to thank you guys. You've given us what to take away, what to think about. The idea that these fire consequences have marked lives for generations, and that has created victims and heroes. Often the people that are forced to think on their feet when life overtakes them. And this is fire in this case, you know, and that's something for us to kind of learn from and be grateful for, I think, that these people could think about putting the dress over the kids to help them breathe, you know, to get to a burned over area when you can't get to water, to think in terms of letting other people know. It's amazing how many people got on a horse and spread the word. And we've got to give them credit because they're not just thinking about their own family or their own stuff, they're thinking of others. And that's part of that community spirit, just as there was that community sense of grief and concern over the victims of the Moose Hill and their families, you know. these are the parts of the memory, the stories we want to make sure are told. Maybe not just to give us education, but to make us just a little bit stronger and more resilient ourselves as we look at the future. To be able to plan, think on our feet, take care of other people. The lesson of the forest fires. And that fire is always going to be with us. The trick is to make it a servant, not a master. Thank you, gentlemen.
You're welcome.
More than welcome.
All right, and thank you for being with us. Maybe what you can take away from this is just take a little walk around your property and think about what it would take to protect it and the people that live on it, which is part of the story of the Peace Country. Thank you for being with us.